A stolen vehicle. A suspect running into the freezing wilderness. Officers in pursuit through the waist-deep water. This should be a routine arrest, but in exactly 15 minutes, everything will change. The man they're chasing won't be a suspect anymore. He'll be a dying victim, and the officers trying to arrest him, they'll become the only thing standing between him and death. Body camera footage captured every second of what happened next in those woods outside Stanwood, Washington. What started as a pursuit turned into a desperate race against hypothermia, where the thin line between law enforcement and life-saving completely disappeared. This is the story of how a chase became a rescue, and how the people trying to put a man in handcuffs ended up saving his life instead. Welcome back to the channel. If you're interested in true crime stories that go beyond the headlines, stories that show you what really happens when split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, you're in the right place. Before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover cases like this every week. Stories where body camera footage reveals the truth, the tension, and the humanity behind the badge. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to March 10th, 2024, Stanwood, Washington, a quiet Sunday that's about to become anything but quiet. Stanwood, Washington sits about 60 miles north of Seattle, nestled between Puget Sound and the Cascade foothills. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. Where crime usually means a shoplifting incident or a domestic disturbance. But on this particular March morning, an officer is about to encounter something that will test every ounce of his training, his judgment, and his humanity. The call comes in. A confirmed stolen vehicle has been spotted, not suspected, confirmed. The plates have been run, the VIN checked. This vehicle has been reported stolen, and right now, there's a man sitting inside it. For any law enforcement officer, this is a straightforward situation. You approach, you make contact, you take the suspect into custody. The officer drives to the location, his body camera recording as he prepares for what should be a routine stop. But the moment the suspect sees the patrol car, routine goes out the window. The man doesn't wait. He doesn't try to talk his way out of it. He doesn't put his hands up. Instead, he makes a decision that will nearly cost him his life. He runs, not down the street, not into a neighborhood where he might knock on doors or hide in someone's backyard. No, this suspect runs directly into the woods, dense, tangled wilderness that borders a river. And not just any river. We're talking about ice-cold water fed by mountain runoff, the kind of cold that can kill you in minutes if you're not careful. The officer keys his radio, calling for backup, but he doesn't wait. He can't. Once a suspect enters wilderness like this, every second counts. Wait too long, and you lose them. The terrain is unforgiving. The woods are thick. And if this man knows the area, he could disappear completely. The officer follows. Now, here's where we need to talk about what's going through this officer's mind. He knows the suspect just abandoned a stolen vehicle. That's already a serious crime. But running suggests there's more to this story. People don't run from a stolen car charge unless they have something else to hide. Warrants, drugs, weapons, or worse. The officer pushes into the woods, his body camera bouncing with each step. Branches whipping past, the sound of breaking twigs and heavy breathing filling the audio. He's trying to maintain visual contact, trying to see where the suspect is heading, but the forest is dense, and the suspect has a head start. Then he sees it, the river. And the suspect? He's not stopping at the riverbank. He's going in. The officer watches as the man plunges into the water, wading deeper and deeper until it's up to his waist, then his chest. The current is pulling at him. The water temperature is probably somewhere in the low 40s, cold enough to cause cold water shock, cold enough to incapacitate someone in less than 15 minutes. The officer makes a split-second decision. He can't let this man drown even if he is a suspect, but he also can't risk his own life crossing water this dangerous without proper equipment. He calls it in. Suspect is in the water, heading downstream. I need K9 and additional units. This is going to be a tracking situation. Within minutes, backup arrives. But this isn't just additional patrol cars. This is a coordinated response. K9 units, supervisors, and the first whispers of what might need to become a full wilderness rescue operation. The K9 handler arrives with his dog, a German Shepherd trained specifically for tracking fleeing suspects. These dogs are remarkable. They can follow a scent trail hours old through water, across terrain that would confuse even the most experienced human tracker. The dog is given the scent, likely from the abandoned vehicle or clothing, and immediately picks up the trail. The handler lets the dog work, following closely as the K9 pulls toward the river. But there's a problem. The same water that the suspect crossed, the same freezing waist-deep current, the K9 team has to cross it too if they want to stay on the trail. The officers gather at the riverbank, assessing the situation. You can hear it in their voices on the body camera footage. This is a calculation. Risk versus reward. Public safety versus officer safety. Do they cross? One officer starts to wade in. The water hits his boots, then his knees, then his thighs. The current is stronger than it looks. The rocks beneath are slippery. One wrong step and he could go under, and in water this cold, that could be fatal. It's deep, he calls back. Really deep. And cold. Another officer tries a different angle, looking for a shallower crossing point. The K9 handler is watching his dog, who's still pulling toward the water, indicating the suspect definitely crossed here. They make the decision, and they have to cross. They can't let the suspect get away, but more importantly, they can't leave someone out in these conditions without knowing if they're okay. The suspect could be injured. He could be hypothermic already. He could drown. Slowly, carefully, the officers wade into the river. The body camera footage shows the water rising up the officer's body, the current pushing against him. Each step is deliberate. Each movement is calculated. The water is so cold it literally takes your breath away. You can hear the sharp intake of breath when it hits the officer's core. They make it across. On the other side, the K9 immediately picks up the scent again, pulling hard on the lead. The dog knows where the suspect went. Now it's just a matter of following. The team pushes deeper into the woods on the far side of the river. This terrain is even worse than before. Thick underbrush, fallen trees, muddy ground that sucks at their boots with every step. The K9 is relentless, nose to the ground, moving with purpose. Then the dog alerts. The handler recognizes the behavior immediately. He's close, very close. The officers slow down, hands moving to their weapons, not drawing them, but ready. They don't know what condition this suspect is in. They don't know if he's armed. They don't know if he's preparing to ambush them or if he's simply trying to hide. Police K9, show yourself. If you don't come out, I'm sending the dog, and the dog will bite. It's a standard warning, one that often convinces suspects to give up. A police K9 isn't something you want to fight, but there's no response. The handler gives the command, releasing the dog to search the immediate area. The K9 moves through the brush, circling, sniffing, and then suddenly stops. The dog has found him. But when the officers push through the brush to see what the K9 has found, what they discover isn't what they expected. The suspect isn't hiding. He isn't preparing to run again. He isn't in any condition to do either of those things. He's sitting against a tree, completely soaked, shaking violently, his skin pale and lips blue. He's dying. The officer's training kicks in immediately, but this isn't arrest training. This is medical emergency training. One officer approaches cautiously, still aware that this is technically a suspect in custody, But the tactical concerns are rapidly becoming secondary to the medical ones. Hey, buddy. Hey, can you hear me? Can you stand up? The man's eyes are open, but he's barely responsive. His whole body is trembling. Not the kind of shaking you do when you're just cold, but the violent, uncontrollable shivering that indicates severe hypothermia. His clothes are completely saturated. Water is literally dripping off him. The officer reaches down to help him up, and that's when he realizes just how bad this is. The man's limbs are stiff. When the officer tries to help him stand, the suspect's legs barely respond. It's like his muscles have forgotten how to work. This is late-stage hypothermia, where the body's core temperature has dropped so low that normal muscle function is impaired. We need medical. Now, we have a hypothermic subject, extremely cold, barely ambulatory. We need rescue units to our location immediately. But here's the problem. They're in the middle of the wilderness, on the far side of a dangerous river, with a man who can't walk. Getting him out isn't going to be simple. Another officer starts stripping off the wet clothing. In hypothermia situations, wet clothing is your enemy. It continues to pull heat from the body, accelerating the dangerous drop in core temperature. They need to get him dry, and they need to get him warm. One officer takes off his own jacket, wrapping it around the suspect's shoulders. Another radios for the helicopter to drop additional warm clothing and emergency supplies. "Can you tell me your name?" the officer asks, trying to keep the man conscious and alert. The response is slurred, barely comprehensible. The suspect is trying to talk, but his jaw is shaking so hard the words won't form properly. "Stay with me, buddy. We're going to get you warm. We're going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay awake. Keep talking to me." Now, if you're watching this and thinking, these are the same officers who were chasing this guy 10 minutes ago, you're absolutely right. And that's what makes this story so powerful. These officers didn't hesitate. They didn't debate whether a suspected car thief deserved to be saved. They didn't calculate the costs or the risks. They simply saw another human being in mortal danger, and they acted. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into true crime stories that show the complex human side of law enforcement, make sure you're subscribed. We bring you cases like this regularly, stories that don't fit neat narratives, stories that challenge assumptions, stories that reveal truth. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next one. The officer supporting the suspect tries to get him to walk, to generate some heat through movement, but the man's legs keep buckling. His core temperature has dropped so low that his body is shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the vital organs, heart, lungs, brain. Come on, buddy, one step, just one step. You can do this. The suspect manages a single shuffling step. Knee, then another. The officer is basically carrying him, arm around his waist, holding him upright. Another officer arrives with a blanket that's been dropped by the helicopter hovering overhead. The sound of the rotor blades is deafening, shaking the trees. But it's a beautiful sound because it means help is here, resources are being deployed, and this man might actually survive. They wrap him in the blanket, layering it over the jacket, trying to create insulation. But they can't just sit here and wait. Hypothermia is progressive. If they don't get his core temperature up soon, his heart could stop. "How far to the rescue boat?" one officer asks over the radio. "ETA 5 minutes to the riverbank. You need to get him there." 5 minutes. They're 5 minutes from potentially saving this man's life. But those 5 minutes require getting him back through the dense brush, back to the river's edge, where a rescue boat can pick him up and transport him to an ambulance. The officers look at each other. There's no discussion needed. They know what they have to do. 2 officers position themselves on either side of the suspect, each taking an arm over their shoulders. A 3rd officer leads the way, breaking trail through the underbrush, pushing branches aside, finding the clearest path. Let's move, nice and steady, one step at a time. The body camera footage from this part of the rescue is grueling to watch. You can hear the officers breathing hard, straining under the weight. You can hear the suspect mumbling incoherently, his speech deteriorating as the hypothermia deepens. You can see the concern on the officers' faces every time they glance at him, checking if he's still conscious, still breathing, still fighting. Stay with us, man. We're almost there. Don't quit on us now. They break through the tree line and reach the riverbank. The rescue boat is there, engine running, crew ready. But they still have to get him into the boat. The suspect's legs are barely functioning now. He's essentially dead weight. The officers and rescue crew work together, carefully lifting him, supporting his head, making sure he doesn't slip into the water as they transfer him from the muddy bank into the boat. Once he's in, the boat crew takes over. They have warming blankets, heat packs, monitoring equipment. They know what they're doing. The boat pulls away, heading downstream to where an ambulance is waiting. The officers stand on the riverbank, soaking wet, exhausted, watching the boat disappear around a bend. They just saved a man's life. A man who, less than 30 minutes ago, they were trying to arrest. The suspect was transported to a local hospital where medical staff worked to gradually raise his core body temperature. Hypothermia treatment is delicate. You can't warm someone up too quickly, or you risk cardiac arrest and other complications. The medical evaluation confirmed what the officers suspected. He was minutes from death. His core temperature had dropped to a critically dangerous level. If they had waited even 10 more minutes to find him, or if they had decided not to cross that river, this story would have a very different ending. But he survived. And after he stabilized, after he was warm and coherent and out of immediate danger, the reality of the situation had to be addressed. This man was still a suspect in multiple crimes. The investigation revealed the full scope of what he'd been involved in. Burglary in the second degree. He had broken into a building and stolen property. Motor vehicle theft. The vehicle he'd been sitting in when officers first approached was confirmed stolen. Vehicle prowling. Evidence suggested he'd been breaking into other vehicles in the area. Resisting arrest. He had fled from law enforcement, creating a dangerous situation for everyone involved. During his medical evaluation, the suspect admitted to having drugs on board. He specifically denied using methamphetamine, heroin, or fentanyl, but indicated he was under the influence of some kind of upper, likely a stimulant. This explains some of his erratic decision-making. Why run into a freezing river? Why not stop when he was obviously in danger? Drugs impair judgment, and in this case, that impaired judgment nearly killed him. Here's where the story gets legally complex, and it's important to understand this. The suspect is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Yes, the vehicle was confirmed stolen. Yes, he ran. Yes, there's body camera footage of the entire event, but under our legal system, he still has the right to his day in court, to present a defense, to have the evidence examined. That's the way it should be. That's justice. The prosecutor filed charges and the case would proceed through the courts. But there was something unusual about this case that went beyond the legal proceedings. The officers who saved this man's life. They had to write reports about pursuing him. They had to document the crimes he was suspected of committing. They had to sit in court if it went to trial and testify about what happened. But they also had to reconcile what they did in those woods. The moment when the switch flipped from suspect to victim, from pursuit to rescue. In interviews after the incident, the officers were asked how they felt about saving someone who had just committed multiple crimes, someone who had run from them, someone who had created a dangerous situation by fleeing into the wilderness. Their answer was simple and profound. That's the job, not the arrest, not the chase, not the prosecution. The job is to protect and serve. And sometimes the person who needs protecting is the same person you're trying to arrest. Wait, this story went viral for a reason. When the body camera footage was released, it spread across social media, racking up millions of views. News outlets picked it up. It was featured on law enforcement podcasts and analyzed in police training seminars. But why? We see police pursuits all the time. We see arrests. We see dramatic chases. So what made this different? I think it's because this story reveals something we often forget in our current cultural moment: nuance. We're living in an age of absolutes. People are either good or bad. Cops are either heroes or villains. Suspects are either victims of the system or dangerous criminals. But this story doesn't fit those neat categories. The officers in this story did everything right from a law enforcement perspective. They responded to a confirmed stolen vehicle. They attempted to make contact. When the suspect fled, they pursued. They used a K-9 unit. They coordinated resources. By the book. But they also did everything right from a humanitarian perspective. When they found someone in mortal danger, they didn't hesitate. They risked their own safety to save him. They showed compassion to someone who had just committed crimes against their community. Both things are true at the same time. And the suspect, he made terrible decisions. He stole, he ran, he endangered himself and others. But he's also a human being who deserved to be saved when his life was on the line. Both things are true at the same time. This is the reality of policing that often gets lost in the political debates and the media narratives. It's messy. It's complicated. It requires officers to be warriors and guardians, enforcers and caregivers, sometimes within the same 15-minute span. Let's talk about the physical risks these officers took. Crossing that river was dangerous. There's no other way to describe it. Cold water immersion is one of the leading causes of death in wilderness situations. When you enter water below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and this water was probably in the low 40s, your body goes through cold water shock. First, you gasp involuntarily. If your head goes under at that moment, you inhale water and drown. Second, your heart rate spikes. For someone with an underlying heart condition, this can trigger cardiac arrest. Third, you hyperventilate, making it difficult to swim or even think clearly. Finally, your muscles begin to lose function, making it harder to stay afloat or climb out. The officers knew all of this. Now, they were trained in water safety. They knew they were taking a significant risk. They did it anyway. Why? Because somewhere on the other side of that river was a human being who needed help. Let's also talk about the medical response. Hypothermia kills in stages. First, you shiver. Your body is trying to generate heat. Second, you become confused and lethargic. Your speech slurs. Your decision-making deteriorates. Third, you stop shivering, which sounds like a good thing, but it's actually a very bad sign. It means your body is so cold it's given up on the energy-intensive process of shivering. Fourth, your heart rhythm becomes irregular. And finally, cardiac arrest. The suspect in this story was somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3 when officers found him. He was confused, unable to walk properly, speech slurred. If they had waited to mount a more elaborate rescue operation, if they had prioritized their own safety over his immediate needs, he would have progressed to stage 4, and he would have died alone in those woods, hunted by hypothermia instead of police. The officer's quick action, getting him moving, removing wet clothing, getting him to the rescue boat as fast as possible, saved his life. There's a lesson here that extends beyond this one incident. We ask a lot of police officers. We ask them to be law enforcement experts who know every statute and legal precedent. We ask them to be tactical operators who can handle violent confrontations. We ask them to be social workers who can de-escalate mental health crises. We ask them to be EMTs who can provide emergency medical care. We ask them to be community liaisons who build relationships and trust. and we ask them to make split-second decisions about when to be each of those things. In this case, these officers had to transition from tactical pursuit to emergency rescue in seconds. They had to put aside the adrenaline of the chase, the frustration of the crimes committed, and the natural human reaction to someone who just made your job incredibly difficult and dangerous. They had to see past the suspect label and see the human being. And they did. That's remarkable. And it's worth recognizing even as we hold law enforcement accountable when they fail to meet these standards. After the suspect recovered and was released from the hospital, he was booked into the county jail. The charges were formal: burglary in the second degree, motor vehicle theft, D, vehicle prowling, and resisting arrest. The court process moved forward. The suspect, like anyone accused of a crime, had the right to legal representation. A public defender or a private attorney would review the evidence, including all that body camera footage, and determine the best defense strategy. Here's an interesting legal question that this case raises. Could the suspect's hypothermia and possible drug intoxication be used as part of his defense? In court, diminished capacity can sometimes be argued as a mitigating factor. If someone is so impaired, whether by drugs, alcohol, mental illness, or in this case, severe hypothermia, that they cannot form the intent required for certain crimes, it might affect the charges or sentencing. The hypothermia in this case was severe enough that it affected his cognitive function, his physical ability, and his decision-making. Could his attorney argue that he wasn't capable of resisting arrest in a legal sense because he was medically incapacitated? It's a fascinating legal puzzle, and one that prosecutors and defense attorneys would have to navigate. But here's what we know for certain. The officers didn't let those legal complexities interfere with their humanitarian duty. They didn't stand around debating whether he deserved to be saved or whether saving him might complicate the prosecution. They just saved him. The community response to this incident was overwhelmingly positive. When the body camera footage was released, residents of Stanwood and the surrounding areas praised the officers' actions. Letters were written to the department. Commendations were filed. But the officers themselves were notably humble about it. In one interview, an officer said, "We just did what anyone would do. Someone was in trouble and we helped them. That's not heroic. That's just human." I would argue it is heroic, precisely because it was done without hesitation, without expectation of praise, and in a situation where it would have been easier to do less. The K9 handler talked about how his dog performed perfectly, tracking through difficult terrain and cold water to locate the suspect. He credited his partner, the dog, with making the rescue possible. The helicopter crew talked about the challenges of dropping supplies in high winds while hovering over dense forest. The rescue boat crew talked about the delicate process of transporting someone with severe hypothermia. Everyone involved played a critical role. This wasn't one hero. This was a system working exactly as it should. Multiple agencies, multiple specialties, all coordinating to save a life. That's worth celebrating. When this body camera footage hit the internet, it exploded. And social media users shared it with captions like, "This is what police should be," and "Reminder that cops are human too." It was featured on law enforcement appreciation pages, true crime channels, and even made it onto mainstream news broadcasts. But it also sparked debates. Some people argued that the suspect shouldn't be praised or sympathized with because he was a criminal who made bad choices. They pointed out that he stole from people, that he put officers in danger, that he consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. Others argued that this is exactly the kind of policing we should expect, that officers should always prioritize human life, even when dealing with people accused of crimes. Both perspectives have validity, and that's what made the discussion so rich. One comment thread that particularly stood out was from a former EMT who explained just how close to death this suspect was. She broke down the physiology of hypothermia, explaining that once your core temperature drops below a certain threshold, even if you're rescued, you can die hours later from what's called afterdrop, when cold blood from your extremities flows back to your core and drops your core temperature even further. She praised the officers for keeping the suspect moving, for removing wet clothing, and for getting him to professional medical care quickly. They did everything right, she wrote. This man is alive because these officers knew what they were doing. Another comment that went viral came from someone claiming to be a former addict. He wrote about how addiction changes your decision-making, how it makes you do things that seem insane to sober people, running into a freezing river to escape arrest. That's the kind of thing drugs make you think is a good idea. He thanked the officers for saving someone who probably didn't deserve it, but added, "That's the thing about grace. It's not about deserving. It's about recognizing humanity even when the person has lost sight of their own." That comment got thousands of likes and sparked a whole conversation about addiction, law enforcement, and the role of compassion in justice. The video was also used in law enforcement training. Multiple police academies reached out to the Stanwood Police Department asking for permission to use the footage in their hypothermia response training and in their discussions about when to transition from enforcement to rescue mode. One training officer said, "This is textbook. Everything these officers did, the risk assessment, the decision to cross the water, the immediate medical intervention, the coordination with rescue units. This is what we want officers to do. We're going to study this case for years." The story was also picked up by outdoor survival communities. Hikers, kayakers, and wilderness enthusiasts shared it as a cautionary tale about cold water dangers. Several outdoor education organizations used it to teach about hypothermia symptoms and the importance of never underestimating cold water. Now mine, even if it doesn't look that dangerous. But perhaps the most interesting response came from the suspect himself. According to follow-up reports, and these are second-hand, so take them with a grain of salt, the suspect allegedly told someone in the jail that he remembered very little of the rescue. He remembered running. He remembered being cold. But the actual moment when officers found him, when they wrapped him in blankets, when they carried him to safety, gone. Just blank. That's how close he came to losing everything. So what can we learn from this story? What does it teach us about crime, law enforcement, justice, and humanity? First, it reminds us that people are complex. The man in this story is a criminal suspect. That's true. He stole property. He took a vehicle that didn't belong to him. He ran from police. But he's also a human being whose life has value, who deserved to be saved when he was dying. We don't have to choose between those truths. We can hold both at the same time. Second, it shows us what good policing looks like. These officers did their job with professionalism and compassion. They pursued a suspect because that's what public safety requires, but they also saved a life because that's what humanity requires. They didn't abuse their authority. They didn't use excessive force. They didn't let their frustration with the suspect's actions override their duty to protect life. That's the standard. That's what we should expect. And when we see it, we should recognize it. Third, it illustrates the incredible dangers that law enforcement officers face. We often think of police work in terms of shootings and violent confrontations. But the officers in this story put their lives at risk in a completely different way. By entering freezing water, by navigating dangerous terrain, by physically carrying a suspect through the wilderness while exhausted. Those risks are real, and they took them willingly. Fourth, this story highlights the absolute devastation that drugs can cause. The suspect in this case admitted to being under the influence of a stimulant. That drug likely contributed to his terrible decision-making. Running into a river in freezing conditions isn't something a sober person would typically do. Addiction destroys lives. It destroys families. And in this case, it nearly destroyed this man, not through overdose, but through the catastrophically bad decisions it led him to make. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please reach out for help. There are resources available, there are people who care, and recovery is possible. Fifth, this story demonstrates the importance of training and resources. The K-9 unit that tracked the suspect, the helicopter that dropped supplies, the rescue boat that transported him to medical care, the officers who knew how to treat hypothermia in the field. None of that happens without investment in law enforcement and emergency services. None of that happens without proper training. None of that happens without a community that values these services enough to fund them adequately. When we talk about police budgets and public safety spending, this is what that money pays for. It pays for the equipment and training that saves lives, even the lives of people who've broken the law. And finally, this story reminds us that every person we encounter is fighting a battle we know nothing about. We don't know this suspect's full story. We don't know if he grew up in poverty, if he had addiction in his family, if he suffered trauma, if he has mental health issues. We don't know if this was his first crime or his 50th. But we do know that when his life was on the line, people showed up to save him. Not because he was a good person or a bad person, but because he was a person. That's the baseline. That's the foundation of a just society. Before we wrap up, I want to remind you one more time. If you're finding value in these deep dive true crime stories, if you appreciate the way we break down complex cases and show you what really happened, please subscribe to the channel. We put out content like this regularly, and your support helps us keep going. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of people who want the full story, not just the headlines. March 10th, 2024 started as a routine call for officers in Stanwood, Washington. A stolen vehicle, a suspect, a pursuit. It should have ended with an arrest and a trip to jail. Instead, it ended with a life saved, with officers carrying a dying man through the wilderness, with a helicopter dropping blankets from the sky, with a rescue boat speeding downstream to meet an ambulance. It ended with humanity winning over protocol, with compassion overriding everything else. The suspect in this case will face justice. He'll go to court. He'll answer for the crimes he's accused of committing. That's appropriate. That's how the system is supposed to work. But he'll answer for those crimes alive, healthy, and whole, because a group of officers decided that his life mattered, even when he was making it incredibly difficult for them to do their jobs. 15 minutes from death. That's how close this came to being a completely different story. 15 minutes from becoming a tragedy instead of a triumph. 15 minutes from being a case where officers had to report that they found a body in the woods instead of saving a life. But those officers didn't waste those 15 minutes. They didn't hesitate. They didn't calculate. They didn't debate. They just acted. And because they did, a man is alive today who otherwise wouldn't be. He'll have the chance to get clean if that's what he chooses. He'll have the chance to make amends, to change. To become someone different than the person who ran into those woods. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll go back to crime. Maybe he'll struggle with addiction for the rest of his life. Maybe he'll never appreciate what those officers did for him. But that's not the point. The point is that they gave him the chance. They preserved the possibility of redemption, even if it never comes. That's what justice looks like when it's tempered with mercy. That's what law enforcement looks like when it remembers that its ultimate purpose is to protect and serve. That's what humanity looks like when we remember that every life has value, even the lives of people who've made terrible choices. This story went viral because it reminded us of something we desperately need to remember in our current cultural moment. People are more than the worst thing they've ever done. Situations are more complicated than they appear in a headline. And sometimes the right thing to do is crystal clear, even when everything else about a situation is murky. Those officers knew the right thing to do, and they did it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged your assumptions, or reinforced your faith in humanity, please share it. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive. Because there are more stories like this out there. Stories that don't fit neat narratives. Stories that challenge us. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And we're going to keep telling them. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, the truth is always more complicated than it seems.